Welcome back to Ales and Fails Miniatures, where today we will be crafting functional giant snail saddles. Got the idea from Wild Beyond the Witchlight, where in their carnival they actually have giant snail racing. Thought that was a pretty cool idea and wanted to bring it to life. So let's hop into it. To start, I had to run to the hobby store and try to figure out exactly how I was actually going to do this. Did decide on a couple of things. The first thing is that I did want to make it look like leather. So I started by going and grabbing a couple of pieces of leather and some leather dye and getting that dyed to where it can start drying before setting it off to the side. Once the leather had ample time to actually dry, which it usually can take a few hours, I took my scalpel here and just started cutting down into simple little strips that I will use later as the actual straps on the saddle. I did this as slow as I could and did multiple passes just to try to make sure that I get very nice clean lines, because again, you do want this to look like a leather strap compared to something that is more rough around the edges. Once I had what I thought to be plenty of these straps, I set them off to the side because the next part was to actually make the saddle, and I found these earring clips for making your own custom jewelry. I thought they might work perfectly for the saddle. They're about the right size and they can actually clip down to hold the miniature in it. It was just a matter of figuring out exactly how to use them at this point. I knew the first step here was to actually get this metal sanded down because I knew that paint wouldn't stick. And I took my Dremel and actually went through and made sure that even all the little indents where I couldn't quite reach with the sandpaper were nice and roughed up as well. I did find out later that for some reason the primer and paint still didn't quite stick to this. It was falling off a little bit around the edges. If you do have any ideas for how to fix that in the future, please let me know down in the comments. At this point, I felt like most of the surfaces were pretty sanded down, but I wanted to make sure that where I was going to be gluing the leather onto this, it would actually stick, again, because for some reason this metal just was not prone to actually holding any glue. So I took one of my bad scalpels and just started carving lines into the bottom bit of the saddle itself, and I did this on both sides and the edges as well. I was surprised this technique actually worked pretty well to hold super glue and hot glue extremely well. But the next step here was to actually bend the bottom of these earring clips to fit the curvature of the actual snail shell itself, just to make everything fit a little nicer. I did this by grabbing a pair of my hobby pliers and just grabbing on and just pulling it down slightly, and did this to both sides. And then I also did it a little bit in the middle and just kind of tweaked it back and forth until I felt like the position was correct, and then tested it a few times back and forth on the snail before finally deciding if it was correct. Once all of the saddles had been bent, the next step was to primer these. So I glued them onto this tin foil roll and took them outside for some priming. After priming, I wanted to give these earring clips just a little bit more of a saddle shape, so I built up a hot glue around the front, kind of like a toilet seat, I guess, just to make sure that they actually have a little bit more shape compared to being flat. While those were drying, I took some of this round leather cord and dyed it in the same way that I dyed the leather previously. Once the cord had thoroughly dried, I wanted to make the reins for the snail saddle, so all I had to do there was just grab the cord and super glue the end of it into a small loop that would fit around the snail eye stalks. To add a little bit more strength and a little bit more flair to these saddle reins, I grabbed a piece of paper and cut them into strips just like I did earlier with the leather, and then super glued it right on the inside of that loop. Later on, I'll go back and paint these to look like metal so that they resemble a clamp on the end of that rein. After wrapping it all the way around and gluing it, once it's dried a little bit, I go back and trim off any excess and then just glue that little bit of tab down. After that is completely dried, I will put it on the one eye stalk and then pull the rest of the cord back to determine exactly how long I want this rein to be. Once I've got that, I just wrap it around, pull it a little bit tight, which will give me exactly what I need so that I can trim it down and do the exact same thing to this side. Here I took another piece of dyed leather and cut it down into 1.5-inch squares before trimming a little chunk out of the back to fit around the backrest of the saddle. The next thing I did here was cut the edges off of these squares to make it more of a circle to wrap around the bottom of the saddle. At this point, I thought that the leather was the right shape, so I took some super glue and put it just on the inside of that hot glue bead so that I could press down on the leather to make it form to the actual shape of the saddle itself. After that has had some time to dry, I start on the back here, putting a couple of beads of super glue on, and then folding the leather around the back, and then cutting, and just keep moving around to form fit this saddle. This can be a little finicky, so just take your time, trim off anything that you need to, and just slowly move around that outside, doing the best you can to make it look right. And just like that, the seat for the saddles were done. I really like the way these turned out. The next step here though was to take my X-Acto knife and cut some little notches in the side of this saddle so that I could put straps that will hold the first of the metal rings. Once I had notches cut in all of the saddles, I took a couple pieces of my leather for the side straps. I wanted to figure out exactly how big these needed to be, and I just did this by trial and error, just making a loop and then putting it up against the saddle to see if it was the right size before cutting it. Once I did that, I took it and made a bunch more of these because I knew I would need them for each of the saddles. Now that I had an ample amount of these smaller straps, I glued one side of it onto the bottom of the saddle and then threaded on my small ring and then glued the other side as well, making sure to move the ring back and forth so that it didn't get super glued down. And then I did the same thing to the other side, and this is how it turned out. At this point, I really didn't like the way that the bottom of these saddles looked, so I tried to come up with something, and after looking at the images of the actual giant snails from the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, I saw that they had some cloth under them, so I wanted to try something, so I ran back to the hobby store and picked up a couple of pieces of this. Not quite sure exactly what it is, but it's basically just a cheap cloth, and then I cut it to the right size before folding the edges and then gluing it onto the bottom to look like some sort of padding. This was extremely finicky because this super glue really did not want to stick to the cloth. It really just wanted to stick to my fingers instead. So I just had to again take my time and really just slowly curl that edge around onto the super glue. Unfortunately, I did end up with a lot of it on my fingers though. I curled the edges of the front and the back. I thought it just looked a little bit nicer before I super glued it onto the actual base itself. Now that the bottom was covered, I really did enjoy the way these looked. That cloth worked out perfectly and just looks like padding underneath the saddle. But I did want to put some leather on the backrest itself, so I broke one of the clips, grabbed the back, and used it as a stencil to cut out pieces of leather for all of the different saddlebacks. Once I had enough of these, I just super glued them to the back of the saddle, and I really do like the way this all looks now. But I do know that the next step here is to make all the straps. The first strap will just be a short one that goes down to a secondary loop that will then split to the front and back of the snail. So this first one should be pretty easy to build. The first thing I did here was just thread it through the ring and glue it down. Then I added another ring to the other side and did the same thing. And this was just kind of based on looking at the snail and how far it actually needed to go down on the snail before splitting off into the other two straps. After building one, I just used it as a size template for the other side and built another. Once both sides had their first down strap, I just wanted to get an idea on exactly how big the front strap needed to be. So again, I just glued it on here just like I did previously. And then I'll wrap it around the front of the snail to try to determine the length. And once it's in a good spot and threaded through, I'll just pull down nice and tight, and then I'll trim off any extras and glue it down as well. These self-clamping tweezers really came in handy here because it could hold the strap while it was gluing, and I didn't have to stand there and hold it the whole time. I could start moving on to the next one. I did the same thing for the back strap here. I started by gluing one side of it on, and then once that was nice and dry, I put the whole saddle on and did the same thing as I did previously, which was just thread it through, pull it tight, and then hold it down until I can glue it. Sometimes if I put too much glue on it, I'll just take a piece of tissue or cloth and soak up some of that super glue before pressing it down. While that's drying, I added a piece of leather that I'm using for the straps on the front of these reins just to give it a little bit more support and make it to where I can add another piece of this cord that will connect to the saddle itself. Finally, it was time to connect all of this together. I started by just putting it in place, determining exactly how high or close I wanted it to the saddle, and then I just trimmed it and glued it on both sides. The last step here was to take some lead belcher by Citadel and just paint those front clips on the reins to make them match everything else, and then we're done. So I really did enjoy this project. It was a fun one, making all these snail saddles, their helmets. They just turned out absolutely amazing. I really enjoy the fact that I can remove them to where my giant snail miniatures still have function outside of just this, and the fact that these are functional. All you gotta do is clip your miniature on there and you're off to the races. I just really enjoy that. I think these turned out amazing. If you did like this video, please do like and subscribe, and we will catch you in the next one. Cheers.